Today we're going to continue working on these pants that I have created for my Balthier fan art. And last class, we had done everything that we needed to do to be able to transfer the details from Marvelous Designer over to a retopology that we also have created using Marvelous Designer 12's retopology tools. And we also, in the process, have set up a quick, light turntable to help us when sculpting. Marvelous Designer really only gives us cloth that look brand new. So the moment that we want to feel like some type of garment has been lived in, we have to do a sculpting pass on top of our garment afterward. So the process can really be broken down into 4 distinct steps. The first being a cleaning pass. The second being a sculpting pass. Then a texturing pass. And the last pass will be an alpha stamping pass. I think that breaking down the workflow in this very structured approach of 1, 2, 3, and 4 is a great recipe to follow to be able to really address all the details that we want to add on top of this garment that also allows us to work from bigger details down to smaller details. We will be doing that using Blender. And for this particular class today, we're going to start with a cleanup pass on these pants, meaning that we will address any kind of little artifacts that could have been created by the transfer process, or if there's anything else, perhaps we have panels that are not aligned properly. We will also do a little bit of work on the stitches. We will do all of that before we start to sculpt folds on top of these pants. We're going to talk about the different brushes of Blender that will be helpful for us to sculpt folds and memory wrinkles. We will take advantage of Blender's noises to automatically generate details on top of our garment. And I also took the time to go to the thrift store and acquire a bunch of garments that I thought were interesting to use as references, either because I liked the kind of memory wrinkles that I could see on top of these garments, or there's just something about the textile itself, the detail map, if you will, that I thought was particularly interesting, or I particularly liked the details around the seams, the kind of puckering, if you will, that we get around the seams. So I'll be intercutting this particular class with some of those references here and there when it makes sense to do so that you can see where I'm trying to go with the details that I am putting on top of these pants. So our goal for today is to do the sculpting pass on top of these pants. And next class, I will talk about the Substance plugin for Blender, which is freely available that you can grab to be able to generate a series of detail maps for your own garments. So next class will cover step number 3 out of the 4 steps that I have mentioned previously. And after that, we will have one extra class where we will use alphas generated from Marvelous Designer as alpha stamps within Blender to add even more details around our puckers and elsewhere over the garment. So there's a lot of very exciting content coming to Aggang.studio on how to work on your garment within Blender after you're done with the Marvelous Designer stage. But before we get too involved into detail maps and alpha stamps, we need to start with those steps number 1 and 2 that I have mentioned previously, the cleanup pass and the fold sculpting pass. So let's get to work. So first things first, let's clean up this mesh, and we'll do so by just hunting around for artifacts that could have been introduced on the borders of some of our garment panels because of the transferring of details that we have done using the Outgang cloth nodes. And these pants are actually pretty clean, so really the only place that I have a little bit of artifacting is on the pleats that are running down on the inside of the leg. That's pretty much the only place that there really is some artifacting, and what I'm going to do here is really just to use the draw brush of Blender and hold shift to do a little bit of smoothing. Let me also check here what are the tablet settings. I found that I can have a really awesome feeling pen pressure by setting the tablet API over to WinTab and then playing the softness value here to be somewhere around -0.6, -0.7. If this is all new to you, I suggest that you go and you watch some of the first classes on sculpting in Blender that we have on Studio, because I really do a deep dive on how I like to configure Blender and the different brushes in there for optimal sculpting. So for our draw brush then, let's hold shift to do a little bit of smoothing. And I don't want to over smooth the surface, but I definitely want to smooth enough so that these pleats become a little bit softer there, and we kind of get rid of a little bit of the artifacting that seems to be happening in that particular zone. Some of these artifacts come from the fact that these pleats were actually created using a few different garment pieces or a few different garment panels within Marvel's Designer that were fused afterward. But the kind of line that is running down the middle of the pleat right now seems to be a little bit of an inset line that is there. We will actually want to smooth that out and get rid of it entirely, because I actually don't want to keep that line in there. One thing that is very useful, we haven't really talked about this in some of the previous classes, I don't think, but because we are using a multi-res modifier for this, we can actually go through the different subdivision levels by pressing Control and then the number of the subdivision level to which we want to go to. So pressing Control 1 to go to the lowest subdivision level, and pressing Control 2, 3, or 4 to go to the different subdivision levels that we have. I find that actually very useful as a shortcut, and certainly it makes it a little bit easier to go up and down in subdivisions as opposed to be using the page up and page down buttons on our keyboard. Because I've been doing a little bit of smoothing, one thing I want to do is to go back to my checker and also in the process get out of sculpt mode so that I can see the impact of the smoothing that I have done. Because the last thing that we want to do is to start to over smooth the surface to the point that the checker starts to be overly stretched. So it's a good idea once in a while just to get out of sculpt mode and switch over to the checker material that we have created together previously there. And just make sure that we are not introducing any kind of ugly distortion through the process of smoothing the artifacts that we have. You can also see here how the pleat that is running on the inside of the leg and then running up here on the back of the pants, the pleat on the right side has opened up a little bit because of the pose of the character, but right under where the butt is, so right under the butt and then a little bit to the right, you can see here on the back there's this kind of weird structure that kind of has started to appear there. So that's something I'll definitely want to sculpt away here. So in this particular case, I'm just using the Draw Sharp brush of Blender. And I'm trying to play here with the fall off to try to see what is the most possible sharp fall off that I can get for this particular brush. And in this case, it's by using a custom fall off and adjusting the curve here a little bit. And I'm just going to sculpt in this particular pleat, and I'm also going to hold Control to inverse the direction of the Draw Sharp brush to also pull out the surface here. So really, I'm just trying to clean up this pleat to, in a way, kind of simplify it perhaps a little bit, because there are just some folds here that I just don't really like. Part of sculpting on the garment after the Marvelous Designer phase is also to question the folds that Marvelous Designer has given us, and to wonder whether those folds that we have somewhere are folds that we want to keep, or if rather they are folds that somehow we don't think are very appealing for the character here. So the pleat elsewhere looks great, but it's just in this particular zone, I'm just not all that happy with how this particular zone here looks. There will be more sculpting that needs to be done on this plate here in the back to make this look a little bit better. So we're not quite done with the cleanup in this particular zone, but sooner or later, actually, and certainly before I go too far, one thing that we have to do is to deal with the stitches that we have. Because right now our stitches are a separate object within the scene. And it is important before I go too far here to make sure that those stitches will be set to follow any type of deformation that I will do to the surface of these pants. So we really need to deal with this before we go any further. So to make sure that my stitches will follow any type of deformation that I will do to these pants, we are going to select the stitches here go to the modifier tab, and we are going to add a surface deform modifier to these stitches. Selecting the high poly of our pants as the target for that, and then clicking on bind. But as you can see, there's actually a little bit of a complication here, which is that Blender is giving us an error message saying that the target contains concave polygons. I was actually able to fix this particular problem rather easily by getting rid of the surface deform modifier, first of all, and then selecting our high poly and collapsing the multi-res. And we'll have to do a little bit of a smoothing on top of these pants before the multi-res is applied to fix this particular problem. So I'm going to apply the multi-res, and of course, because we want to apply the multi-res, and we will certainly reconstruct it later, truth be told, this is something that we should have done right at the beginning of this particular class, but we are still at the beginning of the cleanup phase for these pants, so it's completely okay. And so what I want to add here is a smooth modifier to my high res, which confusingly is called pants slow right now, but this is my high res now. So we want to apply a smooth modifier on this and then set the repeat value here to 1, 2, or 3. Truth be told, even at repeat 1, I believe that I got it to work properly a few times. And put the factor value here over to 1. And so this will do a very, very, very slight smoothing operation on the mesh. Probably so slight that you won't even be able to say that there has been a little bit of smoothing applied on the mesh. But for some reason, doing this smooth operation using the smooth modifier on top of the high poly seems to fix the particular warning that we had here. So I've just reselected the stitches here, reapplied a surface deform modifier, reselected the high poly as the target for it. And when I have clicked on bind here, you can see that now our stitches have correctly bound themselves to follow the pants around. Once you have confirmed that your stitches will correctly bind themselves to your high poly, go ahead and get rid of the modifier from the stitch mesh because we actually have to apply it after we have our multi-res modifier that is applied to the high poly. So we can now go and we can reapply the multi-res modifier on top of the pants, reset here our advanced options so that UV smooth is set to none, boundary smooth here, we set it to keep corners. It's always important that you do this, okay, every time that you reapply a multi-res modifier. And then afterward, we can do an unsubdivide to go back to our lowest subdivision level for these pants. As I've said, I should have done this at the beginning of the class before I do any type of major changes, certainly to the pants in a way that it would affect the position of the stitches. But so far, because all that we have been doing was to smooth these pleats that we have, so it's completely fine. But once again, make sure that you are doing this certainly before you do any type of major proportional changes to your pants here so that your stitches will correctly follow anything that you will do to them afterward. I've also talked in the previous class how sometimes the multi-res, if we reconstruct all the way down to the lowest subdivision level that we actually have generated originally, which in this case would actually be number 5, our UVs tend to blow up. And I've talked in the previous class as to my thoughts as to why that happens here. So just keep in mind that I am keeping this at subdivision 4. That's the lowest that I'm going. And I'm just reapplying here the checker on these pants just to make sure that I really have not gone too far in unsubdividing this mesh. So these UVs all look pretty good overall. As you can see, we don't have any type of artifacting or kind of distortion, or our UVs haven't blown up in our face here. So I'm really just checking the checker here to make sure that everything is fine. And now that everything is fine, we can go ahead and select our stitches once again. And once again, apply a surface deform modifier to them. Select our high poly as the target and click on bind. And now our stitches will correctly be bound to follow any type of sculpting or proportional changes we could do to these pants. And that's great because there is a major proportional changes I want to do to these pants, which is that I want to relieve a little bit of the pressure that is going on in the crotch of the character. I think I've talked about this too briefly in the previous class, but I find that the pattern that I have created for these pants in Mars Designer are a little bit too tight around the crotch, and it would have been too much work for me to try to fix that in Marvel's Designer directly. So I figured I'll just fix that sculpting wise, as you can see, by just taking the grab brush of Blender and just pulling down a little bit on the crotch here, just to make the crotch of Balthier, I suppose, sack a little bit more and allow him to breathe a little bit more down there, so to speak, because I was just starting to feel a little bit of pity for poor old Balthier that had to deal with pants that were very, very tight in this particular zone. So that's one of the major changes actually I wanted to do to the overall volumes of these pants. And because we have bound our stitches now to follow any type of deformation we will do to these pants, it means that if I look at the stitches now, once again, and very important too, of course, that you go back to your highest subdivision level when you do that, or at the very least at the subdivision level at which you have bound the stitches, because that is the subdivision level that they expect to be bound at. If you're not at the correct subdivision level, you will very quickly notice it because your stitches will just be completely blown up here. But as you can see, I have pulled down on Balthier's crotch, have gone back to my highest subdivision level. And now that I'm selecting the stitches, you can see that the stitches have followed that particular volume change that I have done to the pants. So everything is great. Our stitches are correctly bound. Life is wonderful. It means that when we will be sculpting any type of details too around the seams, especially some puckering around the seams, our stitches will nicely follow that as well. Also, just a little trick here, okay, is once in a while to duplicate your surface deform modifier, apply the first copy of it and keep the second copy in the modifier stack. It's not strictly necessary to do that, but I just like to do it because when I do major proportional changes, it just helps the stitches always look like they're in the proper place when we are in sculpt mode. Because you might have noticed, or you will notice on your side certainly, that you will only see the final position of the stitches and the impact of the surface deform modifier when you are out of sculpt mode and within object mode for your pants. But anyway, that was a lot of very technical explanation here for how to deal with the stitches. But once you're correctly set up there, you can really just forget about them and they will always follow around any type of deformation that you will do to the pants afterwards. So it's actually a very, very powerful workflow. And to my knowledge, there is not any way to do that easily within ZBrush. Anyway, so back on sculpting and on cleaning up these pants. And what I'm doing here is that I've just used the grab brush here and I've set the fall off here to sharper, which means that when I will be pulling on the mesh anywhere, we will be pulling it as creating these kind of very sharp points in the process. And I also turned on topology within the options of my grab brush so that I am moving these panels independently. And I'm just hunting around, as you can see, for places where some of these panels are a little bit misaligned, or perhaps where the border of the panels are a little bit round, but I actually want the borders or the corners perhaps to wind up being a little bit sharp and angular. So I'm really just doing a little bit of cleanup here to see where are there gaps in between some of the panels and trying to close those. I am certainly playing around the fall off here on my grab brush as I'm doing so. If I want to create something that's very angular somewhere, I will use the sharper fall off. And if I want to have a smooth movement of the mesh as I use the grab brush, I will go ahead and set my fall off here to smooth. You can see some of these pleats here, I'm just going to very lightly and gently pull on them to give the impression that they are coming out from under the other garment panel, perhaps, that is right under where they are here. So just a little bit of cleanup here around where these pleats right here are inserting into the piece of the garment to which that they do in fact insert, and making sure that I'm getting rid of any type of overlap or crashing through here. So once again here, just using our grab brush and just hunting around the mesh for places that needs to be tightened up here a little bit. As you can see, I do like to keep a lot of these panels that we had from Marvelous Designer. I like to keep a lot of them separated and not necessarily welded together. There are, of course, panels that I do want to weld together because perhaps I had multiple panels in Marvelous Designer, but I actually want to have one continuous mesh afterward once I am sculpting on top of the garment afterward. But more often than not, I actually like to keep my panels separated if I do want them to look separated visually speaking. We could, of course, sculpt seams, fake seams using some brushes. We could definitely do stuff like that. But I just like to keep a lot of panels separated because I just find that visually speaking, it just adds a very, very nice detail when you can really feel that there is a slight volume change or a little bit of thickness to the different panels that serve to create our particular garment. I really like to have a little bit of 3D-ness there around the seams. And so instead of having to manually sculpt those, we are essentially getting them for free out of Marvelous Designer. And especially if we have gone around and created some type of complex seam arrangement. Just like I actually explained in one of our garment creation classes on outgang.studio, how to deal with seams, how to create what I call in there 2-layer seams and 3-layer seams. And I actually have a tendency to use the 2-layer seam approach that I show in that particular video. I have a tendency to use that a lot more than the 3-layer seam, which for all intents and purposes, I'm not really using anymore. The 3-layer seam because it's very complicated to set up. It does lead to very interesting details. It is visually pleasant, but I find more and more that the 3-layer seam is something that is a little bit too finicky to set up, a little bit too complicated to set up, and the quality increase, if you will, visually speaking, is not really all that worth it. So that's one of the garment creation classes that we have on outgang.studio, by the way. So if you're not really aware of my techniques to create 2-layer seams or 3-layer seams within Marvelous Designer, it is something that I explain in there. But so for the most part, this garment has been created using the 2-layer seam approach almost exclusively. And you can see the consequence of that is that where our different garment panels meet, we do have that nice overlap. So we have different garment panels that are nicely overlapping on top of the other garment panels. And it just creates a little bit of visible thickness that I think is very, very pleasant here. Always a great idea to switch our lighting around, switch our viewport shading mode from the default solid in which we are to material preview if we want to look at our garment with proper lighting. It can help because we get shadows, we get proper shadows that sometimes can help us to better judge the depth and the relationship between these different panels. I think it's very, very important that we do get that right. We don't wind up having panels that are a little bit too far away from each other, but we just can't tell because we don't really have proper shadows to be able to really tell us where those different panels are. But in this particular case, you can see that I'm working mostly with solid right now because I feel quite confident that I'm doing a proper job here at moving these different panels around and really dealing with the borders in between the different panels. But as you can see, I'm really just using the grab brush in this particular case and really just making sure that I feel that overlap between the different garment panels, as you can see. That overlap is nicely visible, but that also I am not creating gaps in between those different panels. So I'm really just doing a little bit of cleanup here. This is also related to the bias value from our outgang cloth nodes. The higher is the bias value in our outgang cloth node, the one that is related to the transfer node. The more cleanup we'll have to do, like we're doing right now, of just kind of playing around with the borders of these different panels, making sure that our overlaps look good. The higher is our bias value within our transfer cloth node, the more of this that we will have to do, because that bias value smooths out a little bit the borders of our panels to get rid as much as possible of um, artifacts that could be introduced because of the transfer process. Anyway, that also gets quite technical, but I have talked extensively about that in the previous classes that talk about exporting out a Marvelous Designer using the Outgang cloth nodes. So Once again, another reason why I want to keep that bias value the way that I had explained in that previous class to be as low as possible. But anyway, this really doesn't take that much time. As you can see, we're just very slowly just going around our garment here and really just looking at those overlaps between the different panels that we have and making sure that we can feel that there is really one panel around where the seams are of our garment, making sure that one of the panels on one side of the seam feels like it is nicely overlapping the other one. So yeah, of course, because we have not merged a lot of these panels together, it means that we have more of these overlaps to deal with. But once again, I personally like to keep a lot of these panels unwelded because I just find that visually speaking, it leads to a higher increase in quality. You can see in the crotch here, just right under the crotch, there's something happened here. And I think this actually happened because of actually this was a bias value that was perhaps a little bit too low when we were using the Algan cloth nodes. There's just this kind of little zone here that just hasn't transferred properly. But once again, here, just using the grab brush and just pulling, yanking on that little piece of cloth that was kind of sticking out here from where the under the crotch was. I can just fix that so that visually speaking, we are getting rid of that little problem that we had there. So we've pretty much fixed everything that we wanted to fix on the pants themselves, but there is a little bit of work now that needs to be done on the stitches themselves. And there really isn't that much work, okay? But if I take the stitch here and I apply my surface to form modifier, you'll see that as I zoom in here, we still have places here where the stitches, they're actually going through the mesh a little bit. And I can take the grab brush here and I can pull them out here. There really isn't that many zones where this has happened, but in this particular zone here, you can see that for some reason the stitches are just not nicely on the surface of the model, and they're actually crashing through a little bit for some reason. So I'm just going to grab the stitch here, go within sculpt mode on the stitches directly after I have collapsed the surface deform modifier on them. And also, I've switched over here to the material preview viewport shading mode so that I can see the shadows from my lights, because once again, those shadows will actually help me to judge whether my stitches are floating a little bit too far off the surface or if they're just nicely embedded within the surface. I find that those shadows just help me to judge better the distance between those stitches and the model underneath. Because if we didn't have any shadows right now, it would really be hard to tell whether our stitches are directly in contact with the surface or if they're just floating a little bit over them. So once again, here having that high quality lighting in this scene is very useful just to be able to judge properly whether our stitches are exactly on the surface of the model or if they are just a little bit offset from it for some reason. And this is pretty much the only place on the garment where my stitches are somehow misaligned. Um, and once again, I will actually blame the bias value from our Algen cloth nodes for having created that. But from a visual inspection of the rest of the pants, we do not have this problem elsewhere. So this is pretty much the only place that we have to fix that. But anyway, do also inspect your stitches if you have exported them from ROS Designer. Do make sure that you are inspecting them to make sure that they are nicely resting upon the surface of the garment everywhere. I can see here too, I have some stitches that for some reason are just a little bit misaligned or just need to be pulled down a little bit so that they look nicely in contact with the mesh. Other places too, you can see here there's one or two of these little stitches that seem to have become mangled here. So for these here, I can probably here just use a smooth brush, smooth this one here until that particular stitch becomes smaller, just like the other ones. These stitches are so small, it's such a small detail that you really don't want to go overly crazy with trying to address and fix all the little tiny little stitches because for some reason some of them might just not have transferred properly. Something has happened to some of these to give them a little bit of a mangled look. And but for the most part here, just a little bit of sculpting, smoothing, or in this particular case, I think there's even here stitches on different levels here. So there's like stitches on the inside somehow that seem to be uh, appearing on the outside of the garment here. So I can just take my grab brush once again, turn on topology, and then just pull these in here. So just do a visual inspection of your stitches. Make sure they're nicely resting on the surface of the garment. If some of them have become mangled in the process, see what you can do about them. Either if they seem enlarged, go ahead and smooth them a little bit to shrink them a little bit. Or if other stitches are just completely misplaced, you can even just go ahead and perhaps delete them entirely. Do what you need to do to make sure that your stitches are all nicely on the surface of the pants as opposed to be embedded within them or floating on top of them. Just do a one pass here to make sure that your stitches look as good as they can. Once we're done cleaning up our stitches, let's go ahead and reapply the surface deform modifier. And once again, as you can see, we're having this problem again of our warning here from Blender telling us that we have concave polygons. So this really sucks because we have to collapse our multi-res modifier once again on our pants, do the whole smoothing thing that I have told you about. Here we'll just use one repeat, and we'll have to afterward test here to make sure that our stitches, when we apply the surface deform modifier, they are binding correctly. Delete the surface deform modifier, take your pants again, apply the multi-res again, set your advanced options here once again, UV smooth set to none, boundary smooth set to keep corners, and then unsubdivide back down to your lowest subdivision level here, or the lowest subdivision level +1. So really, this is also why you want to do all this cleanup at the beginning here, because we really don't want to always constantly have to collapse the multi-res and re-unsubdivide it. Really, it takes a while to do that, right? So we want to do this cleanup on our mesh, on our stitches as early as possible, so that once we do start sculpting our folds, we can really just forget about them and know that they will look good no matter what happens afterward. But that's it. We're done cleaning up our stitches. And in fact, we are also done cleaning up our mesh. And here, once again, I'm just double checking with my checker once again to make sure that everything is right. And it means that we are now in a position where we are done with our cleanup. Everything looks great. Everything looks clean. And we can now start sculpting some folds. The first thing we're going to do here is just to create some face sets for these pants based upon the different panels that we have on the pants. If you're coming from ZBrush, face sets are pretty much the equivalent of polygroups that you have. And you can isolate a face set by pressing H on your keyboard while your cursor is over one of your face sets. In this case, we'll mostly use these just for visual aid, just so that we can see where the separation is between the different panels. And we'll start by adding a few more folds here to the back of the knees. So the back of the knees here is what we would call a compression zone. And because we are within the compression zone, we want to see in there a lot more of those nice diamond folds. By the way, I do have a video on YouTube, and there is also a class on nowgang.studio that deals with fold anatomy. So what type of structure do we encounter when dealing with folds in different zones? What are compression zones? What are tension zones? We talk in there about X structures, Y structures, Z structures. If you are going to sculpt folds, you first have to understand folds, of course. But so in this particular case, because we are deep within a compression zone here on the back of the knee, we expect to see a lot more of those regular diamond folds start to appear. And you can already see here that I am, first of all, using the standard brush or the draw brush here of Blender, first of all. And I'm just trying to create some of these triangles or perhaps some of these Zs, perhaps some of these Z structures. I'm trying to align those so that they will be nicely aligned with the seam that is on the side of the knee here. The peaks of those particular fold, I want those peaks to be aligned directly on the seams on the side of the knee here, because every time we have a seam somewhere, that seam is structurally of course, a lot stronger than the rest of the garment, right? And because of that, a lot of these folds that we have, they will have a tendency to stop where those seams are because those seams are much stronger than the rest of the garment around it. And also because we are deep within a compression zone, I also want these folds that I am sculpting here on the back of the knee to also look like they are tighter or they are narrower, if you will, than the other folds that we have elsewhere on the garment. As you'll see throughout this video, really, I will be using almost exclusively here the draw brush and also the draw sharp brush to sculpt our folds. I'm actually a big fan of using different brushes, such as the nudge brush, and I'm also very happy that there is both a nudge brush within ZBrush and that there is one within Blender and that they both do the same thing. I am a big fan of using the nudge brush to sculpt some folds, but that is only when we are sculpting folds using Dynamesh or Dyntopo, because of the fact that the nudge brushes will have a tendency to stretch the geometry. We are using a mesh here that has been UV'd already, of course. And because of that, we cannot use any type of brushes on the surface that will start to pinch or stretch the surface in a way that will be destructive to those UVs. So it means that when we are sculpting folds on a mesh that already has UVs, as we do in this particular case, we are actually quite limited in terms of the brushes that we can use to sculpt some folds. We cannot use anything that will pinch or stretch the geometry. We really can only use brushes that will push the geometry in or out the way that the standard brush or the draw brush does. Of course, smoothing is also fine, and so is using the grab brush, but it means that our toolkit is actually quite limited here, and we really are mostly, for the most part, limited to either the draw brush or the draw sharp brush to sculpt the details that we want to be sculpting. And even things like the clay brushes, of which I am usually a big fan when sculpting, once again, using Dyntopo, or if this was within ZBrush, sculpting using Dynamesh. I'm a big fan of using the clay brushes, but once again, we won't be able to use the clay brushes in this case either, because we already have thickness on this mesh. And of course, the clay brushes, if you have thickness on anything, if you've ever tried this yourself, you will see that the clay brushes will collapse the thickness. So we cannot use the clay brushes either. So really, we pretty much are limited to only using the draw brush or the draw sharp brush. And this isn't a limitation of Blender, because if we were sculpting folds within ZBrush, we would be facing the exact same situation. We would pretty much only be limited to using the standard brush and smoothing at the same time. So really, basically, what this means is that it's really not a question of technique as much as it is a question of getting proper references to really have a good idea of where you are going in terms of the folds that you are trying to sculpt here, right? It's all about the different structures of these folds, how you go about sculpting them and making them visually interesting, observing our references, and simply trying our best to sculpt folds that look realistic, that look lifelike, that communicate what it is that we want to communicate about our garment in different places. So references, references, references. And then once you think that you have enough references, get more references. Go to thrift store the way that I have done and buy a few garments that look similar to the garment that you are working on, and really carefully observe the folds there in different zones. Wear those garments, take pictures, do everything that you need to do so that you have all the information at your disposal to sculpt some proper folds. Other tools that we can use when we are working on a mesh that already has UVs is these multi-res displacement brushes here. There's also the multi-res eraser that is right over the brush that I have currently selected. And we'll use that a little bit later. But for now, this particular multi-res displacement nudge, I believe it's called, the one on which I currently am, you can kind of use that here a little bit, as you can see, to kind of try and create some of the eyes within some of the peaks of some of your folds. You can kind of try to use that. I'm not going to use it too much, but it is one of the safe brushes to use. So it's kind of the equivalent of a nudge brush, but without destroying the geometry in the process. So go ahead and play around with that one if you want to a little bit. But in this particular case, as you can see, I'm still doubling back down on the standard draw brush here to try and sculpt those eyes within the peaks of some of our wrinkles here. So once again, eyes, that is something that I talk about in the cloth anatomy class, either the class that we have on Naga in the studio or the video that I have on YouTube. There's a peak, peak, peak. These are peaks. Inside of each peak, right? What happens is that because of the internal resistance of the cloth, we will get inside this kind of negative space. And this negative space, we'll refer to it as an eye. Go and watch that. There's a lot of lingo here. But I think once you do understand the anatomy of folds, I think it does help to open our own eyes, pun not intended in this particular case, to what folds are, how do they look like, and what are the different substructures that you will encounter within the folds that you have. Because beginner mistake that I often see is that people just think that folds are just straight lines, and they just use a standard brush and they just draw a straight line somewhere, and that is what folds are for them. And that's a common beginner mistake that I see. But once you start to understand a little bit more about the anatomy of folds, you start to realize how much more complex those structures can get. Using the grab brush or the move brush, if you are within ZBrush, is also great here because we can actually pull on our peaks a little bit to try and just raise them a little bit off of the surface, as you can see. I'm just going to grab here some of those peaks. I'm just going to pull them off. Just going to help to give them an impression they're a little bit more raised. And just visually speaking, it's a subtle detail, but I find that adds a lot visually speaking. Here, we're going to switch over to the Draw Sharp brush. And we're going to use that just to sharpen up the edges of these different folds. Especially because we are deep within a compression zone, often the folds that we will encounter in there, for a garment that has been used a little bit, those compression zones will have a tendency to start to create memory wrinkles in there. And you can tell a memory wrinkle because it will be quite angular as opposed to have a round profile the way that we would have for folds elsewhere. So memory wrinkles have a tendency to have an angular aspect or an angular profile to them. And so using the Draw Sharp brush is a great way to communicate that. You can see in the process of sculpting these pants, I also had played around here with the scrape brush and the multi-scrape brush, the way that I'm doing right now. I just wanted to see what kind of effect that they would create because they are great. Those are brushes that we want to use whenever we want to make something more angular, more planar. And we certainly have explored some of these brushes in the context of head sculpting within Blender. But I quickly realized when I was using these brushes, what I had told you before, which was what we can see here, which is that all these clay brushes or clay-like brushes have a tendency to collapse the thickness the way that you can see right now. So I tried playing around with those just to see if the behavior would be different than what we have within ZBrush. And of course, the answer is no. So these brushes do collapse the thickness. And so these brushes are actually quite bad to use in the context of a mesh that already has thickness. And so I tried playing around with those a little bit to see the kind of effect that we could get out of it. And they do simplify a little bit, as you can see, the creation of memory wrinkles that have this very angular profile. But ultimately, the fact that it is collapsing the thickness of our garment is way too much of a problem for me. So it's not a brush that we will use going forward here. But I did want to give them a try. And you can see some of these wrinkles that we have on the back of the knee, how they simply look more angular here. So what we want is to really just reach this kind of effect now, but using our standard brush and our Draw Sharp brush going forward. I have a lot more folds now on the back of the knee, as you can see, of course, and that is important for me because I really want to communicate that there's a little bit more fabric there, of course, so that when the knee extends, when the leg extends, there's a little bit of fabric in the back that can stretch, of course, but also the fabric will become looser with time, will become weaker with time, will have a tendency to stretch less and start to compress more because of the flexion of the knee, of course. So it's really important for me that there was some really nice wrinkles here on the back of the knee, the way that Marvel's Designer did not actually give us. But that is important for me to really communicate pants that are a little bit more lifelike. In the process here, you can see too that there's some artifacts. Okay, you might see this on your side too. When you are in sculpt mode, you can see sometimes there's some of these sharp lines that seem to just appear. They're not always there, but sometimes they just kind of seem to appear over the surface. Not the ones that I'm sculpting right now, but you'll see once in a while you kind of have sharp lines that seem to just randomly appear over the surface and seem to be a little bit aligned with the edges of the lowest subdivision level that you have. I've kind of decided at some point to just ignore those. I'm not sure why they're there and how to deal with those, but I don't think that they're gonna hurt us going forward. So you might see some of those from time to time, but for the most part, I think it's quite safe to disregard those. Getting quite happy with these, and of course, once in a while here, switch back to your high quality lighting that you have within the scene, so that you can properly judge the volumes of the folds that you are sculpting. And really just switching the lighting around, also playing around with the turntable, switching the angle of the lights here will simply always help you to just get a slightly different perspective over the work that you are doing, over the folds that you are doing, the volumes that you are sculpting, and will simply freshen up your own eyes to help you essentially sculpt better folds in the end. Because Balthier's right knee was more bent than the left one, there really isn't that much work that we need to do on this side here, but I just want to tweak a little bit of these folds still and just try to improve their look a little bit. But for the most part, there really isn't that much work to do on this side as compared to the amount of work that we had to do on the other side. So for the most part, I think this completes the back of the knees for now. We'll obviously come back on these once in a while when there's little details here that needs to be adjusted, but it is time now to move on and to start to do some work on the folds pretty much elsewhere here. So just do a general fold pass elsewhere on the garment. And really, for the most part, what I'm trying to do here is really just a little bit of what I have done on the knee, which is to try to make the garment look a little bit more lifelike, a little bit more lived in. Of course, if you wear any garments yourself, as you move around, as you sit, as you stand up, as you walk, all of the garment itself will start to shift a little bit, will start to create dynamic folds here and there. Your garment will definitely not look like a garment that has been well posed on a mannequin, but that is always what Marvel's designer gives us, of course. The impression that a garment has been posed perfectly on top of a mannequin, of course, and that has never been worn one day. So our role, really, always sculpting wise, is always to make a garment look more lifelike. And in the process, it also means to often add a lot more wrinkles in different places just to make the garment look more lifelike, more lived in, a little bit more worn here. Which also means in the process, just adding some random folds sometimes from time to time in different zones. And so that's what we're going to do. We're just going to do a general sculpting pass here and just make the garment overall just look more detailed here. This structure here that I had been complaining about at the start of this particular class here. So I'm doing a second pass on it, as you can see, to try and just get rid of the kind of, I don't know how to call it, but the part here that was kind of sticking out in a very ugly way here. So just trying to adjust this particular zone. So yeah, like don't take anything that comes out of Mars Designer for granted. Mars Designer is impressive, but you do have to keep in mind that, as I've said many times already, it will not give you a garment that looks lifelike and lived in. So really do not take anything that Mars Designer gives you for granted. You really have to go in there and really, in a way, question every fold, question every zone that there might not be any fold to kind of wonder, should there be any fold in there, right? So really, it's not because Mars Designer has given you a particular fold somewhere that you have to accept it the way that it is. You always have to approach every fold that you have over a garment with a critical eye and really ask yourself the question, do I like this particular fold or this particular elevated zone of the model, like I've just gotten rid here on the back right of the character? You always have to question pretty much everything. And once again, I've said it before, but I can never say this too much, okay? The best way to get that information as to what should the garment look like is to get references. So either garments that you already have, if you are working on a garment for which you do not have any direct references yourself in your own wardrobe, go and acquire some. Often in thrift stores, you can find things that are used and that are also very cheap to buy. So some of the references that I bought them for $5, which is actually quite cheap, and they are great references to use. So go ahead and really do not discount stores as a great source of references to help you sculpt. In the process here, also because I'm doing some major changes here to these pleats, but also because I want to keep these pleats to be relatively smooth, okay? Because pleats, of course, because there's a bend in the fabric, you kind of expect those to be a little bit more structured to hold their shape a little bit more than what you would have elsewhere. So for that reason here, because I'm retouching these pleats here, I have also gone down to my lowest subdivision level by pressing Control 1 on my keyboard, and I'm doing some of those changes that I want to be doing at that particular subdivision level, because any changes that I do on subdivision level 1 will propagate itself in a way that is relatively smooth to the upper subdivision levels. So just keep that in mind. You don't always have to sculpt at the highest subdivision level. If you are making major changes to a garment, it is in fact often preferable to do it at a lower subdivision level. Very important here for me that the crotch area has a lot more information to it because, of course, the crotch is a zone of high deformation. As we sit down, as we lift our legs, we will wind up having a lot of folds right in that particular zone. And it's a zone that will get compressed and stretched quite a lot. So it will build a lot of wrinkles with time. So really make sure that you are adding a lot more information to this zone than what Marvel's Designer will give you. And once again, just take a look at your references. Try to also figure out what are the tension zones or the tension points over your particular garment. This is something that we do talk about within the cloth anatomy class on outgang.studio. And what you will often realize is that the opening zipper, when there is one on the front here of the crotch of a character, is often a zone that is structurally very strong, of course. There's a lot of layers of fabric there, there's a lot of seams. So it has a tendency to create a little bit of a tension zone, and we often get these really big folds kind of emanating out from the crotch area towards the sides of a garment there. Once again, look at some of the references that you have and try to observe those for yourself. Also, when I do find on a garment a very big plain area, like a very big plain where there's really no information on top of it, I really question whether that really should be a plane that is completely devoid of any folds, or if there should be some type of surface variation there. And not every fold that we sculpt has to be these extremely big folds. Sometimes it's great to just sculpt smaller folds that are more detailed folds, don't necessarily create a lot of surface volume change, but are still there to break how the surface reacts with the light here. So a lot of what I'm doing right now is just this here. Just find where are the planes, like the zones of the model that are completely flat, where there's really not that much information, and just see how can I add some more information to that to try and make the surface look a lot more organic. I don't have direct references for these pants, of course, because these are fantasy pants that I have designed myself. So there's no way I will ever find a reference in real life that looks exactly like those. So a lot of this here is just me trying to, based upon my own knowledge of what folds look like, and of course of studying folds for quite a few years. Of course, when I was working, especially on Deus Ex, those 10 years that I have spent at IDOS Montreal working on Deus Ex and Tomb Raider and Guardians of the Galaxy there, pretty much everything was hand sculpted there. So I spent over a decade just studying fold and being interested by the topic of fold there. So a lot of the knowledge that I'm applying right now is knowledge that I have built through time, through sculpting many, many, many different garments and sculpting all the folds on them from scratch there, which is absolutely invaluable in terms of knowledge, which if you are learning character art, might not be knowledge that you already have. But of course, the message there, I think, is that through time, through sculpting different garments, folds on different garments, folds on different types of fabric, of course, you start to build a bit of a mental library for how folds should look like in different contexts. and on different types of garments and in different zones of different garments, and also how folds should look like in different zones of different garments based upon whether that zone is compressed, extended, flexed, whatever it is, right? So there's a lot of that knowledge that I am applying here, for which there really isn't any shortcuts other than just trying to be extremely precise and rather trying to spend a lot of time observing your own references, of course, because that is really the key to developing knowledge. Is to really just look at references, study references, try to look at the folds, look at the patterns that those folds are taking, wonder why is it that we have a fold somewhere, what type of force are active within the fabric, within the garment to create those folds, right? Folds are like waves on the surface of water. They appear there because something has disturbed the surface and has created some type of surface force that is communicated visually through the waves that we have on the surface of that. So I do like to think of the surface of water when I think of the surface of a garment, and thinking of waves. I think it helps a lot to think about how folds should look like, or what type of forces at play within the medium itself creates folds afterward on the surface of that particular medium or of that particular garment. So yeah, a lot of what I'm sculpting then is just kind of waves, right? Like trying to create a wavy surface. You pull out, you pull in, you pull out, you pull in, and but also part of what I'm saying here is that there is also no shortcuts other than simply spending a lot of time to sculpt a lot of different garments, sculpt folds on different garments, and take some time to really study this here. So you're not going to become a master fold sculptor within after sculpting only one garment. That's true for everything. If you're sculpting faces too, it's the same thing. You have to spend a lot of time to sculpt many different variations of whatever subject it is that you are sculpting. By subject, I mean, are you sculpting cloth? Are you sculpting organic surfaces, faces, anatomy, creatures, whatever it is, right? The key is always repetition and practice across a wide range of objects and models. So don't worry too much about it if the first model that you are sculpting does not wind up being the best model ever. Just don't worry about that. It is very normal as we are learning that the first few repetitions that we are doing, the first models that we are working on, just don't wind up being the greatest models ever. That is totally, totally normal. So don't sweat that too much. And you'll see that as you sculpt more and more models, that every model that you sculpt, you will probably improve yourself. You will probably feel that improvement too. I know, personally speaking, every time I feel that I am sculpting something new, even now, I kind of always feel as if somehow it's the best model that I have ever done, because there's always little things that I learn between sculpting two different models, or just by looking at my previous work. There's things that I learn and that I afterward apply to the next iteration, the next model that I work on. And that's really the process. It's just repetition, working across a wide range of models. And through time, that's how we improve. That's how we become great. So, one of the things that I see often, and it's something that I try to advise against as much as I can, but it's something that I see quite a lot, is students who are, let's say, working on one particular character, and perhaps they've never even created a full character before from start to finish, but they are convinced that the character that they're working on right now will be the portfolio piece that will get them a job later on. And then they just work on the same character for like 6 months to 12 months, and throughout most of that time being completely dissatisfied by the work that they have done, and feeling a little bit desperate too. And you can see that it's kind of dragging them down. It's like they're not able to finish that one character to the degree of quality that they would want, because they think that this one character that they're working on right now has to be the character that will get them a job. It's quite normal that it takes us a few characters from start to finish to really upgrade our own skills and to learn everything that there is to learn. In fact, perhaps even more than just a few characters. So, really, It's a great idea, of course, to work on a character and to be very serious about trying to push the quality of it and to redo things here and there. But at the same time, let's also keep in mind that it takes more than one character to become really, really good at character art and to build a portfolio that will afterward get us the job that we want, right? So just don't worry about it too much. If you're working on one particular garment, on one particular character, and it's not everything that you want it to be, just don't worry about it too much and try to see what you can learn in the process, what kind of lessons can you memorize for the next character that you will work on, and then move on to the next character. And I promise you that that next character that you will work on will be miles better than the first one that you have done, because you will be able to apply all of the lessons that you have learned in creating the first character to the next character that you will do. But okay, so back to this here, right? So you can see that I'm working on a butt right now, and one thing that I'm trying to do in this particular case is just to make the cloth a little bit looser around the butt. So the Marvelous Designer simulation that we got, the cloth seems to be kind of sticking a little bit to Balthier's butt, and that's not quite my vision for how these pants should look like. I don't want it to look like he somehow is wearing a wet cloth over his butt cheeks, and that it is kind of sticking there to his gluteus maximus there. So I'm really just trying to add a little bit more information here to the butt, try to make the cloth look like it is just a little bit more loose and not quite as tight over the butt. At the same time, I don't want to make the cloth super loose and start sculpting some major folds in there because it just wouldn't look all that appropriate. It is normal, of course, for the butt to be pushing up against the fabric a little bit. So directly over the both butt cheeks, I suppose. We don't necessarily want to have some huge folds in there. Although I suppose that would be the case for someone who really isn't working out their ass all that much there. You kind of expect their butt cheeks to be quite small and not necessarily have a lot of volume here. But again, that is not either my vision for Balthier. I think Balthier is someone who would definitely, as a sky pirate, always on his feet, running, walking. I definitely want to suggest that Balthier has some meaty ass cheeks. But that being said, I also don't want it to look like the cloth is so tight around the butt that it's almost looks as if the cloth there is getting a little bit wet. So it's kind of subtle, right? It's like I do want to feel like there is some type of pressing up of the butt against the fabric, but I also want to loosen it up a little bit compared to what Marvel's Designer has given us. So, that's kind of the process, right? It's just like looking at the Marvel's Designer simulation that we have gotten and then comparing with our own references, with our own expectations too, and just kind of asking ourselves a question like, is this particular region here, X, Y, or Z that is on the garment, is that exactly what I want it to be? Or do I want something else here? And always keeping in mind, of course, the Marvel's Designer does not give us garments that are in any way worn. Mars Designer's garments, of course, look like they are these completely well posed garments that are completely brand new and have never been worn one day, of course, because we don't have any memory wrinkles on the surface. There's no kind of surface imperfection. There's really nothing on the surface and on the folds that are generated through Marvel's Designer that suggests to us that the cloth has been worn through time, right? So a big part of what we are doing, of course, at this sculpting stage is really just to add that level of wear to make it look more realistic, more appealing, and to also kind of make the cloth look like it's been shifting around the body a little bit, right? As we wear garments, of course, we move around within our garments. So the garments will have a tendency to shift around, to bunch around a little bit in different places. Garments are not these completely well posed pieces as you would perhaps see in like a Renaissance sculpture or something there. We really want to give some level of chaos almost within the cloth to kind of suggest that these garments have been worn and that the pose that we are looking at right now that the character has is a pose, as if almost we had paused a particular animation of the character as the character was just walking at some point or something, as opposed to be these kind of Renaissance sculptures. I'm just mentioning Renaissance here because that's kind of what I had a tendency to do for like the Renaissance. It's like everything was so cleanly well placed, even like garments wise, that it looked unrealistic. It was beautiful, certainly, but it was not realistic. A lot of what I'm doing is also, as you can see, just to add a lot of imperfection to the surface. You can see that my surface is actually quite bumpy in a lot of different places. So I am, of course, using a combination of the draw brush and, of course, the smooth brush as well. It's kind of hard to see when I am smoothing because I'm holding down shift to smooth, but there's not really any feedback within the UI right now that would actually suggest that. But I am doing a combination of simply using the draw brush for the most part here and also doing a little bit of smoothing, but I'm also not trying to smooth the surface imperfections that I am adding in the process so much that the surface becomes this completely smooth and, well, for lack of a better word, wrinkle-less surface, right? It's like we do want to keep a little bit of bumpiness to the surface. You can also see it as I'm using the draw brush here, when I am using it, that I'm not doing these nice, clean straight lines. I really try to avoid working with straight lines and to just draw straight lines over the surface. Perhaps if you were to look at the pattern that my cursor is taking, it's more akin to some type of like jittering, right? It's like you can see that my cursor just jitters around a little bit. And sometimes I will do more straight lines here using the draw brush, but that is not often. For the most part here, when I am working on these garments and working on these folds and trying to sculpt these folds, I'm really going with my cursor here, kind of jittering around a little bit. It simply helps for me to first avoid that kind of mistake of just treating folds as if they are only a series of straight lines. You can see actually, I really don't have that many straight lines folds wise. I mean, there are some folds that are a little bit straighter, but then again, they do have a tendency to create somewhat triangular structures on the surface, I guess. I do sculpt my folds running down either as zigzags, they're imbricking themselves and creating these kind of Z patterns or these kind of triangular structures over the surface of the garment. So I'm really trying not to think of folds as a series of straight lines. And therefore, too, when I am using my brushes, I am also kind of using the standard brush or the draw brush here of Blender. I do jitter the cursor around quite a lot here, which has a tendency to give us those surface imperfections that I've been talking about, that kind of noisy kind of looking bumpiness over the surface. And I really do not want to be smoothing too much of that out. We don't want to have too much of it, but we also don't want to have too little of it because all that kind of bumpiness will actually blend very nicely with all the other details that we'll add on top of this garment later, such as memory wrinkles, and even like the textile fabric tiling detail map that we will use eventually here at the texturing phase. All of those things will all blend together really nicely to give us the impression of a surface that is nicely organic, has been worn, is not looking completely brand new there. But you can see as I'm sculpting that if I am, let's say, deep within a compression zone like we have on the back of the knee, I will have a tendency to draw wrinkles that are a little bit more linear, perhaps, that do look more like straight lines, and certainly start to create those nice diamond structures or those nice hexagonal structures on the back of the knee there. There's a few of those. So I do have a tendency to sculpt folds like that when we are deep within a compression zone. But outside of that here, so right now we're working on the back of the leg here, and you can see that I'm doing anything but that here. I'm really just drawing or sculpting these kind of details that have a bit of a triangular nature to them, because this is not a zone where there's any type of clear compression or clear tension happening to the garment itself. But we do expect for the surface of the garment to do wind up bending and folding slightly a little bit in different ways. And so I want to communicate that there is that organicity to the surface, but without necessarily trying to create in there the impression that there's any type of really strong compression on one axis or another one there. I like to think about what I'm doing as a series of triangular or perhaps diamond-like depressions or elevations to the surface without those necessarily being always clearly defined. A lot of what I'm doing is just structures, sculpting structures that are more of a triangular nature. Thinking about triangles, like if I make a fold I'll make a fold in a particular angle, then I will make a connecting fold that will go at a different angle from that first fold that I have created there. And so that helps to create that kind of triangle like structure to the surface. But also for me, it does something else too, which I think is very, very good, which is that always kind of thinking in terms of triangles or folds that are slightly diverging away from each other or converging towards a particular point somewhere. For me, it just helps to make folds over the surface of the garment that always wind up being of a slightly different direction, right? You're actually going to have a hard time if you actually look around to find two folds, let's say, that are directly parallel to each other, right? Like every fold that you can see here over the surface of the garment, they're all kind of all traveling at a slightly different angle. There really aren't that many folds that are parallel to each other. There's a few, but there really aren't that many there. And for me, that's quite important here. Like part of the key of really making these folds look very, very appealing and very dynamic and very interesting is to really make sure that every fold that we sculpt are always kind of going in a slightly different direction. In certain cases, like let's say deep within a compression zone, like what we have on the back of the knee, in that particular case, then it is completely okay to create folds that are parallel to each other. But here, like let's say on the front of the pants or on the back of the pants as we were working, because there is some compression, but the garment is not highly compressed in any direction. I kind of really like that idea of sculpting folds that are all kind of slightly angled differently from each other. I just find that it makes the surface look a lot more dynamic and a lot more pleasing. And sometimes we sculpt really big triangles, and sometimes we sculpt smaller triangles within some of the bigger triangles that are there. You know, there is a little bit of a fractal-like nature to folds where you're going to have like really really big folds, and then if you actually look kind of closely, you'll see smaller folds in there, or perhaps in the case of those diamond structures that we've been talking about, those also have a tendency to create that sometimes. You will see very, very big diamonds, and then you'll start to see smaller diamonds in there. So you can kind of see diamonds at different scales or see folds at different scales. So that's actually quite normal. And if you can capture that through sculpting, then that's going to look really fantastic. So I'm getting pretty satisfied at this point. I have pretty much completed a first pass over the whole garment. And so I've really built all of these folds everywhere pretty much at the same time over the whole garment. You know, like I've been moving around the garment quite a lot to make sure that I was creating all of these folds everywhere with a similar intensity, a similar presence, perhaps, all at the same time, as opposed to be only working exclusively on one zone until it's perfect and moving on to another zone when it's until it is perfect. I do very much like to work on the whole garment and do these kind of passes over the garment, but really build the whole garment in one shot, if you will. So now we can start to move on to polishing these folds a little bit more because, as I said, I'm quite happy overall with these particular folds. So we can start to really tighten up these folds here a little bit more and do a little bit of a polish pass, perhaps on top of the work that we have done. And so this is really what we're starting right now. In the process, you can see that I'm also starting to use a lot more the Draw Sharp brush. And for the most part, I'm using the Draw Sharp brush and I'm really going over where we have the peaks of our folds here. So where, let's say, two of our folds are meeting, we call that a peak, where you can kind of see that the surface is kind of rounding around, it's kind of curving around. And I really like to use a draw sharp brush here just to go over the peaks and just to add a little bit more sharpness to those peaks. Just a little bit more, just to sharpen that up here a little bit more, because those are zones of the garment where the garment will be bending just a little bit more. And sometimes there are certainly fabrics that will have a tendency to become a little bit more sharp around those peaks here. So that's kind of what I'm doing here. I'm using the draw sharp brush. I'm just going over some of the peaks that I have created, and I'm just trying to give them a slightly sharper appearance there. I really like the way that makes the surface react with the light. You can see if you look where my peaks are, they're just a little bit tighter. You can see there's a slightly sharper specular reflection there. So I think that that's really, really cool. I'm continuing to polish the surface and kind of looking around the surface, also looking for zones that might not have been detailed at all so far, but overall I have detailed most of this garment to a similar level, so that's pretty great. But I'm kind of always hunting for zones where there is no details right now at all in any sort of way, and kind of always asking myself the question whether there should be something there or not. You can also see here on the back, actually, the kind of noisiness that I've been talking about. That's a result of using the draw brush, but always kind of jittering my brushstroke a little bit. You can see on the back, it's starting to really add this kind of uniform texture of this kind of slightly noisy uniform texture overall. That is relatively smooth, but it is still kind of present. And I really just like how it really breaks up the way that the light reacts with the surface. It just makes for me the surface look a lot more cloth-like so far. So we're really starting to get somewhere with this. And once again, here, always going back and forth now between my standard draw brush and the draw sharp brush and trying to tighten up a little bit the peaks and sometimes some of those edges too, just to make them catch the light a little bit more. Always trying to think in terms of triangles and making some nice triangles visible. Where my cursor is right now, you can see there's a beautiful triangle there that is appearing. What I said a few minutes ago, I think, is very, very important, which is to always kind of work on the garment as a whole and try to really avoid having that tunnel vision. This is something that I kind of always talk about during these kind of sculpting demos. When we were working on Faces 2, I said the same thing a few times here and there, which is that you always want to build whatever it is that you are working on, the garment, the object itself, the head, whatever it is that you're working on, you want to build it all as a whole, right? You want everything to improve uniformly at the same time. You don't want to just develop tunnel vision, work on only one zone for a very long time and not touch the rest of the object that you are working on for a very long time. You want to be building everything up at the same time everywhere. And so you always want to be moving around the surface and kind of always hunting for whatever is the next zone that you simply have not done any work on so far to bring it up to the same level as to what you have done before elsewhere. You can see here that I'm actually experimenting with this multi-res displacement eraser brush. It's actually very useful, I find, to really remove a little bit of the surface imperfection if we have added a little bit too much or reduced the strength of some of these folds here. So this particular multi-res displacement eraser brush, it's kind of like a smooth brush on steroids. I kind of like to think it that way. It kind of simply reduces a lot of the details that are there in a way that's a little bit more strong than what our smooth brush is giving us. So it's a brush I think that is actually quite useful from time to time. Its effect can be perhaps hard to describe, but if you play around with it a little bit and you kind of try to see for yourself a little bit the kind of effect that it does, you might find here and there that sometimes it is a little bit useful to use it. But there's nothing that that brush does we cannot do in any other way. A little bit more work on the back of the knees to make those folds that I have there even more present. I think I can probably add a few extra folds right here just to get this compression zone to read even more. And also extending those wrinkles that I have from the back of the knee towards the front just a little bit, and certainly over some of these seams that are on the inside of the leg there. But of course, because seams are much stronger, of course, it means that we want our folds to kind of start to diffuse a lot more by virtue of the fact that the cloth there, the garment, is a lot stronger and a lot more resistant to bending. In just about a minute from now, we'll start the noise pass on top of this. So, I've been talking about surface imperfections here and there and how I like the organicity that it adds to the surface and the kind of life that it adds to the surface. And at some point, we want to just double down on that and add more and more of that. Because if we look at a lot of real life garment references, we'll see that the surface is always anything but smooth and straight, right? There's always these kind of surface imperfections, surface bumpiness, and that often have this somewhat noisy appearance. So they don't necessarily cleanly follow a compression pattern of some kind somewhere, right? So we want to take advantage of Blender's tools to be able to help us in that regard and start by layering a few noise passes on top of our garment here to really build up a lot of very interesting detail very quickly. Also, by the way, here, if I can just show you very quickly what happens if we use any brushes that are not, let's say, the standard draw brush of Blender. Because I've mentioned this before, but I haven't actually shown it to you. This is actually what happens here. So this is the crease brush. And there's a lot of brushes here within Blender and also within ZBrush that kind of do the same thing. They will pinch the surface and or deform the surface and stretch the surface. So this is kind of what happens here. The topology gets compressed, and in turn, the UVs get compressed as well, and it just leads to a big mess. So yeah, don't use that brush. All right, so for our noise pass, this is very exciting for me, honestly. So I'm very, very glad that we are at this particular part here because I love playing around with noises here. And as you can see, the first thing that I'm doing here is really just taking my standard draw brush here, and I've just duplicated it, and I've called this one noise so that we have a duplicate of our standard brush here that we can go back to. And we'll be using some 3D noises here of Blender. So you can see here within the texture, I have added a mapping 3D, and I have created a new texture here. And we'll take advantage of Blender's built-in noises to really layer a lot of very interesting details very quickly on the surface of our model here. So within our texture properties here, I'm switching over the noise type, and you'll see that we'll be playing around. Okay, I don't have a specific recipe to give you exactly, although I suppose you can always look exactly at the settings that I am putting down in here. But at this point, what I really want here is really just to play around with different types of noises and kind of explore the different types of noises that we have. So I'm on type Voronoi in this particular case. Here we're playing around with distance metric. And what I'm trying to do here is really just to create what will look like some type of memory wrinkles or just surface noises that just look kind of organic and kind of cloth-like. And as I said, I really don't have one exact recipe to give you as much as just tell you just play around with these settings and try to kind of understand for yourself a little bit the kind of effects that you will get with different type of noises. Of course, the type of garment that you work on might require slightly different noise types than the one that I will be building on this particular garment. But at the very least, you can kind of see here the kind of settings that I'm playing around with and the kind of effect that we will get afterward here. But yeah, so I think that experimentation here is key, really. Let's go ahead here and set this over. We can try different stroke methods as well. So either dots or drag dot or something, depending on the kind of effect that we want to give. Either we want to apply one little noise stab somewhere, or whether we want to kind of brush over the surface and create some of that noise that will kind of appear a little bit everywhere at the same time. Playing around with the settings here is key, I think, and kind of exploring a little bit. This is really where you get to have a lot of fun, I find. So go ahead and explore all of these things here on your own here. I like this particular Chebyshev effect because it kind of creates, as you can see here, if you look at the gray texture that we have on the right there, it kind of looks like this very angular kind of noise that could look interesting in the context of creating memory wrinkles. But of course, we also still have to play with our settings here and try to get something that we like out of it. And certainly as I'm brushing over the surface, you can see that we're adding a lot of elevation here. So we actually need to reduce the intensity of our noises so that our noises are a little bit darker overall. I can also switch here to this clouds noise type. And this will give me something instead that will be a little bit more organic. You can see that I'm exploring here. So as I said, I don't have a specific recipe, but I do like this cloud right now because you can see that it's kind of creating these slightly sharp lines, which are actually kind of cool. So it does kind of look a little bit like memory wrinkles. So that's actually quite nice, but we can continue to explore here and try to just get something that we kind of like in terms of effect here. Voronoi too is often one of my preferred noise types, really. Voronoi is a noise type that can be very useful in any type of organic modeling that we're doing. When it comes to faces, I'm also a very big fan of the Voronoi noise here. And what I'm doing now is that I'm really just reducing the brightness here. And you can see that by reducing the brightness over our noise, now suddenly my brush is not just adding this huge elevation every time, but it's actually pushing in and also pulling out at the same time. And so I think that's key because I really don't want with this particular noise right now to be adding elevation or subtracting elevation from the surface. I really just want to modulate the elevation of the surface. And turning off clamp here is also very, very useful because we have reduced the brightness and therefore some of these noise values are actually becoming negative. But yeah, so you can see the kind of effect that this particular Chebyshev noise is kind of creating here. This is kind of interesting. It might be a little too geometric right now. So this might not be 100% what we want, but it's not a bad noise that I think could be useful in certain contexts for different types of cloth, perhaps. Once again, explore this on your own, look at your own references, and the Chebyshev noise might or might not be what you are looking for. I've switched here over to distorted noise. We're just trying another one here. And I'm just playing around here with this noise basis and this distortion drop down here just to kind of see the kind of effect that we can get. Once again, I'm not trying to go anywhere specific in this case. I'm just doing a little bit of exploration with you and trying to see what can we get and can we find something that is very, very interesting. But this particular original Perlin distortion method is actually quite interesting, I find. It has that kind of nice randomness to it that I think is kind of interesting. And as we go over the surface here of the model too, I think there's probably something here that we can use. And certainly reducing the size gives us a better appreciation for the kind of noise that we have. But see, like as I'm gently brushing over the surface, this is starting to look really, really good to me. This really is starting to look a little bit like those kind of random memory wrinkles and that we can kind of see sometimes on the surface of certain garments here. So I actually kind of like this particular improved Perlin noise basis and original Perlin distortion. I think this is actually kind of nice. So I think there's something that we can do with this here. Of course, we need to reduce right now the strength of our brush. Even though I'm using my Wacom here, it still winds up being a little bit too strong for my own taste. So reducing here a little bit the strength, I think makes a ton of sense. And you can see that I can just brush over the surface and I can really build a lot of surface noise, surface variation very, very quickly here, which is really, really cool because I really, really like to take advantage of noises to really speed up my own workflow as much as I can. Yeah, take a look at this here. This is very, very interesting. Just a little bit of it here and there. You don't have to go overly strong with these, but just a little bit here and there. I think it really just breaks up the surface in a way that I think is very, very interesting. And also, I think looks very convincing as memory wrinkles. So I really, really like this particular noise recipe right now. And I actually don't know the kind of details that will appear under my brush because right now we are using a 3D noise, which means that really the only way to really reveal what the noise will look like in any zone is to put a sample down with our brush right now and kind of look to see what will the noise recipe look like under our brush cursor. And if I like it, I will keep it. If I don't like it, I'll just do Control Z and I'll try using this noise somewhere else. But you can see that just applying this noise here, just very subtly here, is actually quite interesting, even around the knees here. So I do want to keep the feeling that the knees are pressing up against the fabric, but having a little bit of surface imperfection there, I think will wind up being very, very interesting in the end. So we're keeping this subtle for now. And you can see what happens if I go way too strong with this. It really starts to look distorted and just not all that beautiful. But keeping it here very subtle, I really like the kind of effect that we're getting. And in certain places, we can also go a little bit stronger with this noise here. Certainly at the bottom of these pants here, we kind of expect, because it's the bottom of the pants, it perhaps will get a little bit more wrinkly for different reasons. So it makes sense to perhaps have a little bit of that noise be a little bit stronger at the bottom. But always what I'm doing is that I'm just putting down samples using my brush. And because this is a 3D noise, we don't really know what it will look like until we actually do it. But certainly when I put down a sample and I like how it looks, I have a tendency to keep it. I will want to keep it. And if I don't like how it looks, I'll just do Control Z and I will try on a different zone. And we also want to, from time to time, vary the size of this particular noise. But so it really becomes just a question of experimentation, trying different things, and hunting for happy accidents in a way that kind of look good for us. So let's go here and play around with these settings here a little bit. I think if I set this to be even smaller, I can probably start to get some perhaps interesting kind of organic breakup around some of the seams. We will, of course, sculpt actual puckers, and we will also use alpha stamps to add puckers as well around our seams. But just a general noise pass like this, still where we have seams right now, does already help to break up the surface here a little bit, right? And certainly where we have those seams, we want to have the impression that the surface is a little bit more broken up because those seams, the stitches, starts to create a lot of tension within the fabric. So we do wind up having a lot more surface noise in those particular zones usually. So this effect right now, it's subtle, but I think it's really, really nice. And I really like how it is breaking up the way that the surface reacts with the light right now. So this is a really, really good base for our puckers that will come later. And I like how quickly we can build up interesting details on our surface using these noise passes. So I'm a big fan of using noises. If you've seen me sculpt faces too, and especially when it comes to sculpting skin pores details, tertiary details in faces, I'm also a very, very big fan of using noise passes because, again, it just helps to create a lot of detail very quickly that would otherwise take us a long time to try and sculpt. Because it is a noise pass, we don't always know exactly what we will get until we see it. But it's so easy just to put down a sample, and if you don't like it, you just do Control Z and you try somewhere else. I really like the effect of this noise around the borders of our garment and the borders of our panels too. And certainly where there are more seams, I will have a tendency to try and express a little bit more of this noise in those particular zones. But important to certainly change the size of your noise. So this noise that I'm using right now, this particular recipe is good around those seams, but eventually I want to make the size of this a lot bigger so that I can do a more general, perhaps noise pass as well, and just try to apply here a little bit more of that noise in random locations over the actual center of the cloth panels that I have, as you can see. The goal really is to get a recipe that blends in nicely with the wrinkles that we have previously sculpted. It shouldn't look like what we are adding here with our noise passes is somehow completely detached and not coherent with all the other details that we currently have over the surface of our garment, of course. So that's why also I'm keeping the intensity here of this noise relatively low. But you can see as I'm just putting down little samples here and there, it's just adding a little bit of information here and there that kind of blends itself very, very nicely with all the other information that is already on the garment. So that's when I know that I have a very good noise recipe. These are really nice here on the front. So pretty much getting to the end of this noise pass, I've pretty much touched the whole surface in some way, shape, or form using this particular noise pass. We can continue to add a little bit of it, but it's about time that we move on to sculpt some actual proper memory wrinkles as well that will look a lot sharper using our draw sharp brush. So that's what we are going to do next. I'm switching here back over to our draw sharp brush, and I'm going to essentially do a sculpting pass on top of some of those noisy wrinkles that got created using the noise pass and elsewhere as well. So with the draw sharp brush, I just want to add even more straight, sharp lines over the surface, especially here on the front of the crotch here. You can see this is a zone that will compress quite a lot, right? So adding some of those nice, straight, very angular lines using the sharp brush, I think really helps to also express a slightly different type of memory wrinkle, perhaps, in what we have added so far, and just helps to kind of sell that this garment is a little bit used, a little bit worn, and that the fibers in different places are starting to get a little bit broken up here. So I really like the effect here of using the draw sharp brush, just doing some of those more angular, sharp lines, perhaps here and there, where we expect the cloth to have certainly been bent and compressed quite a lot. That always goes back once again to that idea of references, looking at the kind of details that we can see on our references, and then afterward finding the correct recipe sculpting wise to be able to express details that kind of look like that. And there's a bit of a rhythm to what I'm doing here because I'm using the draw sharp brush and I'm usually doing one line that goes in, one line that goes out, one line that goes in, one line that goes out. And here again, I'm kind of keeping in mind that idea that we have spoken of before of kind of working in triangles in a way, kind of trying to create somewhat triangular details over the surface. So I'm not doing parallel lines when I'm using the draw sharp brush in this particular case. I'm just doing lines that are always converging towards a point or diverging away from a point here, with the intent of always creating lines that are always traveling at a slightly different angle than the previous lines that I have put down over the surface. You can see how all these details right now are all starting to blend in very nicely. The particular memory wrinkles that we're sculpting here with the noise pass that we had done before, with all of those folds that we have sculpted much earlier in this class, and that is all blending nicely with the result of the Marvelous Designer simulation. Here too, I'm using my noise pass here once again, but you can see that I'm actually playing around with trying to compress this particular noise on one axis. And the result of that is that now we can get some of those memory wrinkles, those noisy memory wrinkles, but that are actually a little bit compressed vertically. And I think that that's really, really nice that we can use that on certain places, like on the bottom of the pants here. Not only can we play around with those noises, but we can also compress those noises, as you can see on one axis, to get a different effect. I think we're done for our noise pass here, so let's just switch back over to our standard brush, and I've gotten rid of the alpha to be able to do that. So I'm getting pretty happy with this overall. This is not the only noise pass that we will add, because once we do add the alpha stamps in a future class, we will also break up the surface even more. But that will be a topic for another day. The next kind of detail that I want to speak with you about how can we create at the sculpting pass will be those puckers around our seams. There too, we will add alphas next in one of the future classes to add even more puckers. But we can already start here and go over with our standard brush, our standard draw brush here. And just as you can see, just quickly sculpt in a few of those puckers around some of our seams. And that's going to help because once we add the alphas later, there's always a chance that those alphas will wind up looking a little bit too repetitive. But by doing a sculpting pass first, so adding some puckers here using our draw brush, we can afterward ensure that whatever we will add later using alphas for even more detailed puckers will also blend in nicely with this sculpting pass that we are doing right now and will help to break up the repetition that we will see. So this is the last pass we will do on this garment today. It is a pucker pass. So I'm just going over all of the seams with the standard brush. And as you can see, I'm kind of trying to add a lot of waviness to the surface. Where there are more seams, I want to add more waviness. And this will blend in very, very nicely once we do the alpha pass. That puckering, I am adding it at different scales. So I don't want to add only big puckers or small puckers. I want to add both big and small puckers. And I want those kind of puckers to start to blend in nicely with each other there. So you can see the kind of effect that it's giving us here on the side of the leg there. We're getting puckers of different scales and it all starts to blend in very, very nicely. Here, I can really sharpen up even more some of those memory wrinkles that we have at the bottom of the pants here. And because this is one of the edges of the garment, it's likely that this will have a tendency to fold a little bit more. And by folding a little bit more, then we will wind up having stronger memory wrinkles there. So this is pretty much it. This is the result of all the work that we have been doing. You can see that if we compare this with the original garment that we have started with, there is a lot more information on our garment. And our garment just simply looks like it is a lot more lived in. So that's what we wanted to achieve with this particular sculpting pass. I'm very, very happy with this. And the next thing that we will do then during the next class that we will have on these paths will be to talk about how can we generate some textures for this and perhaps tweak the material here even more so that we can get an even better render real time out of these pants that will in turn inform us of the strength of details that we are putting down on the surface. Because sooner or later, we want to have some type of tiling textile detail map on top of these pants, because that will impact how we read the details that we are sculpting right now. It's very likely that once we add that detail map pass on top of these pants, that a lot of the details that we have sculpted wind up blending in a little bit too much with that detail pass, and we wind up having to sculpt some even stronger memory wrinkles and surface noisy surface variations on top of our garment. All of these detail passes that we are adding all inform the strength of the detail passes that we have added previously. So, as much as possible, we want to be able to see what our final garment will look like as early as possible in the process so that we are able to accurately judge the strength of the details that we are putting down on our garment. Anyway, so next class that we will have then, we will talk about how to go about texturing these very quickly using the Substance 3D plugin for Blender. So we'll talk about how to use that. And the class after that will be a class where we will be adding those final details on the surface of our model using those alpha stamps. And we will also talk about how to generate those alpha stamps using Marvelous Designer. So that's all very exciting content that is coming to outgang.studio. So don't go anywhere. I will see you next class. Take care.